I was delighted with David and Sandy's presentations, particularly Sandy's, uh, because of it shortens my presentation. That's why I was particularly pleased with Sandy. I mean, I was looked at what I had on my outline. I have an 8-page outline for all my presentations here, all of which we'll put on the our website, and if you want it, we can send it to you. And so we won't cover everything necessarily. I won't cover everything, but it's a good outline, and so you might look up some of these things, or you could ask me questions via email, and I can flesh this out a little bit for you. But I think this gives a good step-by-step analysis of foreign affairs from the beginning of the revolution all the way into the Washington administration. I pretty much stopped them because Todd will be handling the Washington administration and not I. Sandy talks about privateering. She did not go back as far as maybe I would like to go back. I mean, she had a limited amount of time, but privateering was very, very important in the French and Indian War. And so you get men like George Clinton, the governor of New York, first governor of New York, as a young man, I mean, a teenager, he signs up on a privateer that goes to the Caribbean. And that's his first 2 years of wartime experience. He gets there, and then he goes up and fights in Canada in the 1750s and 1760. Thomas Paine, born into a mixed family of Quaker, father's a Quaker, mother's an Anglican. And so when he reaches adulthood, his father took him out of school when he was only in 5th grade. He only had 3 years of schooling, but his father took him out and apprenticed him to him being a staymaker for women's corsets. And he passes his apprenticeship. Well, you can't have 2 staymakers in the same little town, so he has to find something else. What is he going to do? Privateer. So he signs up as a privateer. His father is not happy. His father's a Quaker. And so what's the ship he signs up on? Anyone know? The ship Terrible. Captain? Anyone know the captain? William Death. Isn't that wonderful? And the father just stops Thomas Paine from going to sea. He says, you can't do this. You can't be a military man. And he agrees, okay, I won't go. And that ship is sunk on its first encounter, that privateer. Otherwise, perhaps Thomas Paine would have been dead. 80% of the crew is killed in that first encounter. A few months later, he signs up on the King of Prussia, another privateer. And they go to the Caribbean, and they make money. As a crew member, he got a cut. Sandy said most of the crew members, I don't know, it would be most. Some of them got paid, but I think most of them got a cut of the prize. And whenever they saw a merchantman, whenever they saw a sail on the horizon, they salivated because that was their money, that was maybe their pension. Obviously, the most went to the captains, but the crew also. So when John Adams is going across to become one of our commissioners abroad, get these men safely. That's the first instruction to the captain of the Alliance. Second, if you see any merchantmen, capture them. Where they see 3 merchantmen, 3 sails off in the distance, and let's go after them. Well, they turn out to be men of war, not merchantmen, and the Alliance starts running away, and 2 of the British ships close in, and the cat and mouse kind of a game, and they never really fired on each other. So, but Paine did go to war as a privateer. He made enough money so that he didn't have to work for 6 months. And during that 6-month period of time, he studies, he goes to London, lives, he's unemployed, he goes to lectures, he meets Benjamin Franklin, becomes enamored of the American experience going on. So it gave him the luxury to be an independent scholar in his learning experience. But I love the name of the ship and the captain. The ship Terrible, Captain William Death. I think anytime you look at foreign affairs in the American Revolutionary era, you have to have some kind of background to see what they were coming from. And so there are colonial agents. Anyone know what a colonial agent is? at this time? This is sort of a lobbyist. Every colony has a colonial agent. Benjamin Franklin is the colonial agent for 5 colonies and for the Massachusetts House of Representatives. So there, Massachusetts doesn't necessarily have an agent only, but the legislature has a patriotic. You have the other side as well with Governor Thomas Hutchinson. He doesn't want to have Benjamin Franklin as the agent, colonial agent. And so the agent is a lobbyist, but also doing other things and representing the interests of whoever he's representing, whether that's a colony or a branch of the legislature. And so that's an important entity, and it's sort of a embryonic foreign relations relationship that's there. The King and Council, the Board of Trade eventually, they have cognizance over all American, colonial American legislation. That's not an emergency. So it's like 6 months. They pass a law, and it's got to go overseas, get approval from the Board of Trade, and then come back to America, and it's in play. And so James Madison, in his preparation for the Constitutional Convention in the spring of 1787, writes letters in which he says, we've got to reestablish King and Council. He doesn't want a king again, but he wants this supervisory authority over the states, just as the Board of Trade, the King and Council supposedly had authority over the colonies. And so one of the important provisions of the Declaration of Independence, how many of you seen the movie 1776? A wrong, big mistake in 17, I love the movie. I have a DVD of it. I watch it every 4th of July. But the big error in it is they're not voting on slavery. That's not the provision that's in the Declaration of Independence. There's no provision in the Declaration that condemns slavery. The paragraph at the end that is condemned by Edward Rutledge and other Southerners is the condemnation of the king for vetoing colonial laws to prohibit the foreign slave trade. And the reason for that, according to Jefferson, the king shouldn't exercise his right to veto here, but the reason that the king did it is because of the lobbying of the Royal Company of Africa, an English company that is making huge amounts of money with its corsairs, its ships in the African slave trade. And so Jefferson condemns the king, not us. We're not the problem with slavery. It's the king who has prohibited us from prohibiting the importation of slaves, which means slavery is growing in America. Otherwise, we would have gotten rid of it, supposedly. So that's what's in 1776. But it's an example of the king's involvement in domestic policy, really, and really quite involved. So that's something to always keep in mind. The British are getting advice from different folks. And the advice is usually bad. And the problem with that is how blind are these British officials? They don't understand these folks, Americans like Thomas Hutchinson, placemen, that is folks, Englishmen who've come over and are occupying positions, whether they be the governor, royal governors, or they're on the Supreme Courts. So Native Americans that are, in essence, they'll be loyalists, placemen, British placemen, or refugees. These are loyalists that leave and that resettle in England. They are giving the English officials all kinds of advice, and it's bad advice from the get-go. And it's that way even in post-war, the post-war America and post-war Britain. And you look at the writings of Adams and Jefferson and Franklin, and they can't understand how these British officials can be so blind that they continually accept the advice of these people who are quite prejudiced against the Americans. I mean, it starts all with Benjamin Franklin and the Hutchinson letters. Anyone know about what that is, the Hutchinson letters? Well, Franklin's over there, and he gets possession of letters from Thomas Hutchinson and Peter Oliver, who becomes Chief Justice of Massachusetts. And these are letters very harsh against the patriotic movement. And bring over the military to stop this. Well, somehow or other, Franklin gets possession of these letters, and as the colonial agent for the House of Representatives, he decides, I'm sending these to the House of Representatives on one stipulation, that you don't publish these. Who the hell do you think he's kidding here? Don't publish these. He's doing it intentionally for that purpose, obviously. And in the end, he's called to task. He admits that he's the one that has sent these over and caused them to be published. And he then is, in essence, kicked out of England. He is persona non grata then. In Parliament, he is chastised for doing such a thing. And obviously, he leaves. I would love to do a book called Becoming American. When did individuals become an American? When did George Washington become an American, as opposed to a Virginian or a British gentleman, which is what he wanted to be? When did Benjamin Franklin become an American? I had a good friend, Leo LeMay, who's passed away now, but he was an expert on Franklin, and I asked him that question: when did Franklin become an American? And he said he never became an American. He was always a citizen of the world. Well, I don't know if that's true, but certainly with those letters of Hutchinson, when he decided, what should I do with those letters? When he decided to send them to the House of Representatives of Massachusetts, that's when I point him that he became an American. He had to decide. He could have gone in either direction. Remember, he favored the Stamp Act, and he wanted his cronies to be appointed the Stamp Act agents in America. So he was waffling there. Between being allied with the British and being allied with the American cause. But that publication of those letters were critical. And then another general point to make is the difficulties of communication. We don't appreciate that in this world that we're living in today. I mean, it's just astonishing. I look back upon my life early as a professional and communicating with friends in Europe. It would take 3 to 4 weeks to get back and forth. Write a letter and then send it and then get the message back. I mean, 3 or 4 times a day I'm communicating with people in Europe now. It's just amazing. But you have time, secrecy, codes, duplications, and Adams writes a wonderful letter. He says, it's a long, long letter explaining what happened in the negotiations. And he says, when I finish this, I realize I haven't communicated everything I need to, but I can't go over this again. So you're not getting all the information you need in your reports. There's just too much. The nuances are such that there's not that complete understanding between the officials in the capital back home and the ministers and envoys abroad. And so, to a great extent, you have to go by your instructions and then fly by the seat of your pants and adjust to the circumstances as they come, because you can't wait 2 months to make a decision to get news back. If you're in England and you've got a minister who's in France, well, maybe that's a 4-day turnaround. But in America, it's more like 2 months as a minimum. Usually takes about 4 weeks. Could be faster, but 4 weeks to get from America to Europe. Takes about 6 weeks to get back. Why does it take 2 weeks extra to get back? Benjamin Franklin asked that question himself. I'm asking it for you. I look like Benjamin Franklin a little bit, don't I?
Winds?
Gulf Stream, exactly. And he realized, and he maps the Gulf Stream. And the Gulf Stream is, in essence, a river within an ocean. And when you're going there to Europe, you get in the Gulf Stream, and it speeds you up. If you're coming from Europe to America, if you're in the Gulf Stream, you're in trouble. You're going to really be slowed up. But you try to stay out of the Gulf Stream so that that current doesn't stop you. The Spanish knew about the Gulf Stream with Ponce de Leon's. He was sailing from one point in the Caribbean to another point, going south, with a northerly breeze behind him, but after an hour of sailing, he was further away. How's this happening? Well, he realized then it's the Gulf Stream. The water is taking him backwards, as opposed to the breeze that's supposedly pushing him further south. And so he mapped it out, and it turns out there were 2 maps of the Gulf Stream in Spanish archives. it was very secret because it's a military weapon, military knowledge. And the Spanish used it regularly to get their money ships back to America, to Spain. And they didn't want anybody else to know about that. So communications is a difficult thing at that time. And it is incumbent upon the foreign ministers to use their judgment more so than we would normally expect. And they felt it was absolutely necessary to do that. Now, there are consequences of the French and Indian War that are very important to understand the American Revolutionary situation. First of all, the British now have 30 American colonies, not just the 13 that we know about all the time, but they're more than double that amount that they now have. Some they had before the French and Indian War, but they inherit, 5 Canadian provinces, and they inherit East and West Florida from, inherit's not a good word, they get that because of their victories in the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. And so now they have East and West Florida, and they have Canada. And it's a very humiliating treaty of peace, Treaty of Paris of 1763. And it lays the groundwork for the French antagonism toward the English and Spanish antagonism toward the English and the desire for revenge. And so when the opportunity avails itself of cooperating with the American colonies, there is a likelihood, there's a willingness on the part of the French and the Spanish to get involved when maybe otherwise there wouldn't have been. So that's an important thing, consequence of the French and Indian War. Another consequence is the English and the colonists don't need each other anymore. Now that's a significant thing, and most historians don't realize that. But Great Britain needed the American colonists as military allies in their continual struggle against France and Spain. The American colonies, 12 of the 13 that are established in the 17th century under the rule of the Stuart kings. Georgia is the one that comes about later in 1732. But the English have their troubles in the 17th century, domestic problems. The 18th century, it's internationalism problems. And so they have 4 wars, international wars, with Spain and France. And the colonies get involved. The first 3 of those wars started in Europe. The 4th war, the French and Indian War, starts in America and then becomes a world war. And so in each of these, the mother countries want the colonies to participate. And America is, the American colonies are highly contributory in these struggles, and particularly in the French and Indian War. And the Americans understand how much they've contributed. The British, to a certain extent, do as well. So the mother country wants the colonists to be a full-fledged partner, not on an equal basis. Washington wants to be an officer in the British Army. Never could happen because he's a colonist. And the English, we have a mindset about the English, who the English are. They're wonderful people, aren't they? Well, they're terrible people at this time. And if you're a Frenchman or a Spaniard, you think of the English as being haughty and domineering and greedy and just about any derogatory projection you can offer. That's what the British are. And the Americans are quite happy to be part of that empire. But with that change in imperial policy, they're going to realize the English are not so great either. But from the other perspective, the colonists no longer need the British Army and Navy because now the French are not in Canada and the Spanish are not in Florida. So you don't need any English protection. So the French and Indian War is sort of liberating for both sides. That dependence that they each had for each other is no longer there. And yet what is there, what remains, is a tremendous wartime debt for both sides. The colonists, particularly the New England colonists, Massachusetts especially, because they were so active in that war, with Canada being so close. But also the English have a tremendous wartime debt. And that debt was incurred primarily because of the Americans who started that war. It was some insignificant Virginia militia officer who started that war. I think his name was, George Washington? He started that war, and it became an international war. We don't want them to do it again, because they put this tremendous debt on us, and now we've got their freedom protected here from the Spanish and the English, and so we want to protect them from themselves. So let's have the proclamation line, another product of the French and Indian War. You can't go beyond the crest of the Appalachians. The whole reason for the French and Indian War, from the American perspective, keep the French out of that western territory by Pittsburgh. Now we're told by our own mother country, you can't go there. They're not happy campers. That line becomes a very important line in the treaty negotiations that come about later. So that's, I think, a good sort of general background to the American Revolutionary situation. Any questions on that? Yes.
Do you think that, with Pontiac's Rebellion and things like that, do you think that they felt like they still needed some British protection in the West with some of the settlers moving across there? Do you still feel like they still needed some British presence there, or not really?
Basically get out of our way. Okay. This is the way it is with most of the colonies in the States. We can handle it. Okay. And one of the things that you'll find, I'll mention this a little later, I'll come up, since this question's come up right now. One reason that Madison gives, is it Madison? No, probably Jay. Jay in Federalist, maybe 4 or 5, one of the others, talking about foreign affairs. He says the problem that has occurred, war is one of the problems, that we need a national government as opposed to separate confederacies. And we have had throughout our history Indian wars that have been started by states. Now he's writing in 1788, 1787, 1788. The states have started these wars, not the national government. The national government would never have a war with Indians. We're not that kind of thing. We're not that kind of people here. But it's the Georgians who continually are land hungry. And they want, what do they want from the U.S. government? They want ammunition and weaponry. They don't want troops. We can handle the situation. We don't want troops because we don't want you interfering. We don't want you saying, don't fight these Indians. We want to kill them. We want to push them back. Part of David's paradigm is how can we get these Indians to be out of our way and properly utilize the territory that God has given mankind. They're underutilizing. We have to utilize it appropriately. And that means either they're peaceable with us, we push them across westward, across the river eventually, or put them in reservations, or better yet, assimilate them into our culture. Let them become good white men, and then we can all live peacefully together. Jefferson says we've got 2 concepts with Indians, fear and justice. We should do right by them, but we should always keep them in fear because they hate us. And that's the only thing that will keep them peaceable with us, is their fear of us. And so, yeah, I would say they're not going to turn their back on English support, but I think most of these colonies would like to approach the Indians by themselves because that gives them a free hand to do whatever they want to do. Any other questions on this background? Yes.
My timeline's up, but when you mentioned Franklin releasing those letters,
yes.
Was he or was he not Postmaster General at that time? Or did that
Yeah, he was. He was. Now, not present in America, but yes, he was. He has deputies. William Goddard is his deputy in the mid-1770s and helps establish that colonial system. Yeah.
Like that's why it made it so easy for him to spread the letters, or did that?
Oh, no. The letters were not sent through the post office. They were sent by a ship and hand-delivered. The post office is always a questionable thing, and it's always interesting to see. I mean, that's one of the things about secrecy. one of the things that John Jay negotiates when he's Secretary for Foreign Affairs is a postal treaty. People open up the mails, and particularly governments open up the mails of the diplomats. And so you like to have a safe conveyance, not to go through the official channels. And when Jefferson is writing to his love interest at that time, she's in England and he's in France, and he often won't sign his name because he realized this mail is being opened. And so one letter, in fact, he says, for nosy eyes that are looking at this, you shouldn't be doing this here. This is not your business. So Franklin's connection with the post office has nothing to do with really the release of those Hutchinson letters.
And it doesn't jeopardize his position?
Well, sure, it jeopardizes any position that he might have when it's divulged that he has done this. Sure. I mean, this is a dastardly thing that he's done to promote this antagonism. I don't know that I would say it was necessarily treasonous at this time, but it was certainly someone was condemned for this in England, and they were taking the blame. And Franklin, being honorable enough, said, "No, I'm the one who released it." And he would like to have kept his confidentiality in this, but for the honor that he had, he would not allow someone else to take the punishment for what he had done. So yeah, he was persona non grata after that.
Dr. Kaminski, the stuff with his son,
Yes.
Franklin's son, was
I don't have a son. That's
But
what he
was-
said in 1776.
Yeah, but his son was, looked at it. He was a loyalist,
Sure.
right? And so Franklin's was a little bit questionable whether or not his allegiances were with the colonies or England at that time when he released. Do you think that played a role in kind of proving that he was much more on the side of the colonists?
No, I don't think they had gotten to that point yet.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
That's before there's the estrangement between Franklin and William Franklin, his bastard son. And in the movie 1776, it's reported the New Jersey folk, he's governor of New Jersey, he says your son has been captured and sent to Connecticut. And how is the bastard? Is he okay? And they are estranged. In the mid 1780s, they write to each other, and Franklin says, "Blood is thicker than water. He should have been a patriot." And so the blood meaning American blood. He was an American. He should have stayed true to America rather than stayed loyal to Great Britain.
There's another question in the back, I think. Okay.
I hear a lot about the Canadian colonies and things like that during the Revolution. What was Florida's position during the Revolution?
Florida's position?
Yeah.
Well, Florida is settled by the Spanish, and there's Spanish colonies all around on the Atlantic coast, naturally, with St. Augustine, but different places, Pensacola, and on the Mississippi River, Natchez. And so with the Treaty of Peace of 1763, all that gets transferred to England. And during the war, the Spanish did very, very little to help the Americans where the war was taking place up north and even in the south, that is in South Carolina and North Carolina and Virginia. What the Spanish are doing is going in Florida and capturing their old colonies. And consequently, that becomes an issue, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. What the Americans want, they would like the British to keep possession of Florida, not have the Spanish. And Jay is involved in encouraging the enemy to attack our allies, not our technical allies, because Spanish never signed a treaty with us. But it's an anomaly there that the American commissioner is in fact advising the enemy how to attack our friends. And he says, I want that to be secret. Don't tell anybody about that. Okay, let me get back to some things that Sandy did not mention, I think, that are important in the chronology. The Olive Branch Petition is in July of 75. The king responds to that in October of 75, saying that the American colonies are in a state of rebellion. So when the Declaration of Independence comes about, many of the Americans say we didn't declare our independence. George III declared us independent by saying we were in a state of rebellion. We're just reacting to it. There are two key documents that are wonderful foreign relations documents. Thomas Paine's Common Sense. How many of you read Common Sense? Terrific. You should read it. I mean, it's a fantastic document. And there's no independence before Common Sense, and it has become the talk of the town after Common Sense. So it is a transforming event in American history, January of 1776. And then the Declaration of Independence, which Paine calls for. It is, as I mentioned before, in response to one of the questions, it is primarily a propaganda document trying to convince the American people and other countries why the Americans are declaring their independence. And the whole point is so that the Americans will rise up in arms. And it's a combination of this is the reason for it, and Thomas Paine explains how we can win. I mean, it's pointless to declare your independence if you can't achieve it. But Paine explains how we can win. We're not going to be run over easily by the British Navy and the British Army. Half the British Navy is in dry dock at any one particular time, he says. And so the Declaration of Independence is a critical document from a couple perspectives. There's a peace commission that comes from Great Britain, and they report back, we missed it by 10 days. If we'd gotten here 10 days before, maybe we would have stopped them. I doubt it. But once they took that step, they're not going back. And so the Declaration is a major step for America as a whole. It also is a necessary step to get the foreign support, as was mentioned, I think Sandy mentioned it. Unless you declare yourself a nation, you're not going to get the support of other nations. And partly because what's the alternative? Reconciliation? You don't want reconciliation. You don't want to come out and help the American colonies and then to go back to England. Well, now England's mad at you for what you did in trying to subvert their colonies away from them. And so what is there always in the mind of the French is no reconciliation. That is absolutely imperative before you're going to offer them any kind of overt support or recognize them as a country. And so what that means also is you don't want the Americans to lose. You don't want them to give up, and you don't want them to be defeated. So you're sort of forced to support them from that perspective. And so by declaring independence and then showing in the Battle of Saratoga, which is October 1777, and reported in France in December of 77, when that happens, okay, it looks as if it's a done deal. America has declared its independence and looks as if it's going to stay independent, and maybe it will win. We know there's a great possibility it will lose if we don't support it. And we want to support it because there's a zero-sum game here. However powerful Great Britain is, we want to take away that because there's only a certain amount of power and prestige and money available, trade. And if we take that away from Great Britain, we will benefit and they will suffer. And we want them to suffer. They deserve. God has given us this time in history to show what God really thinks of Great Britain. He wants to humiliate them just as Great Britain has humiliated us in the past. And we are the instrument of God in doing that if we now take the opportunity. And so you see that all along. Now the English, on the other hand, they have the obverse of the coin. What they say is, we'll give you independence eventually, but we want you to guarantee us you won't have any permanent alliance with another country. So they don't want the exact thing that the French don't want, the English don't want, but different country. They don't want America and France to be like that. They want America to be neutral, basically, but friendly toward Great Britain in every other way. And they should, because Americans are basically from English descendants. St. Eustatius. Anyone know what St. Eustatius is? Okay.
West Indies.
Sarah, what's that?
It's in the West Indies?
Yes, it is.
Now, that's where I'm a little confused. because, was it Dutch?
Dutch.
But then they also said it was kind of a neutral trade place where all these American merchant ships would go and get their gunpowder and their weapons. And then, was it Bermuda that helped them build the ships? One of the West Indies,
I don't know about that, building ships. But certainly there's a date in American history that should be remembered, and it is, write this down, 16 November 1776. This is the date you should celebrate. We should all celebrate, particularly we in this conference right now. It is the first time in history that a foreign country recognizes the United States of America. An American fleet goes into St. Eustatius, which, as Sarah said, is a smuggling entrepot. You cannot trade with the different countries, West Indies, Spanish, French, Dutch, and English. They outlaw other countries there. But St. Eustatius is wide open. It's a rock. It is not like Jamaica. They don't have plantations. They've got 500 warehouses. And you go there and you trade. At any one time, you might have 50 to 100 ships that are either in port or coming into port or leaving port. And one of the things that the British do that helps the American cause is they pull up Pearl Harbor. They attack St. Eustatius and capture it and force the Dutch to become allies of the United States. But the American fleet on the ship Andrea Doria, not the ship that sunk in the Atlantic in the late 50s, but this is a Genoese admiral, Andrea Doria, from the 15th century. He goes there and he's coming in there trying to buy ammunition and arms. And he fires a salute coming into the port. And the commander of the fort communicates with the governor and says, "What should I do?" And the governor says, "Fire a salute back." Barbara Tuchman, you know that name? Great author. She wrote her book, The First Salute, which is about this. This is the first time that someone recognizes the independence of the United States as a country. It really is a remarkable thing. And the St. Eustatians, they pay for it later on. When the British attack and conquer St. Eustatius, they burn it to the ground as retribution for what they did in recognizing the United States. So that's an important date in American foreign relations. John Jay is appointed as our minister to Spain in September 1779. Lafayette comes to America in June of 1777, an important date. And then the preliminary peace treaty is signed in November of 1782. Now, all that is sort of background to what I want to talk about in the final 3 minutes of my presentation. Now, if I steal a little bit of time from the next presentation, I'm the next presentation. So I have 3 pages of notes for this first one and only a page and a half for the second one. So I'll talk a little bit longer now and take away a little bit from, thank you. Vergennes considerations. You're going to be discussing that with Tim as a document. It's one of my favorite documents. It is one of the great documents in American history, and it's virtually nobody knows about it. It's published infrequently and even less frequently in English, but it is, in essence, a white paper. Vergennes sends agents to America to see what's going on and what needs to be done, and they decide that there will be secret support for the Americans. But Vergennes writes this paper to advise the king and the king's ministers. Vergennes is the foreign minister for France, and he is remarkably prescient. I characterize his considerations as David, if he were writing on this, a 21st century diplomatic historian, couldn't do a better job than what Vergennes did in that. On the scene at the time. It's just remarkable what he did to analyze the French situation vis-a-vis the American situation. And he sees the danger that faces France, the danger of reconciliation, the danger of the British winning, If the British win in America, they might subjugate their own people, which would give them more authority at home, more authority to attack France and Spain later on. If the British lose in America, they might save face by attacking French and Spanish islands to make it look as if it's a real victory. Plus, they'll get a lot of money by doing that. It's very profitable. The West Indies colonies are usually more profitable than the 13 mainland colonies. The money that they're bringing into the economies of the mother countries, and so there is a danger that's there. If the British lose, and if the Americans become independent, a lot of the commercial activities will transfer to Spain and to France, which is a beneficial thing. Again, it's a zero-sum game involved. What Vergen says is, don't commit ourselves. Let's be secret about this. Let's not let the British know what we're planning on doing. They're worried about us coming into the war. That's a good thing that they're worried. That helps the Americans because the British have to keep some military at home to protect against a potential attack, both naval and army attack on the mainland on the islands of England itself. What should France do? And Bergen says we should supply them secretly. We should remain neutral until they convince us that they can survive. There should be no treaty with the Americans until independence is guaranteed. We shouldn't be dealing with colonies. That's inappropriate for a great country like France to be having a treaty with colonies. Not a wise thing. Also, Sandy mentioned at the end the League of Armed Neutrality, important factor because the League wants to mediate at different times, and a mediation is almost mandated. If they decide they want to mediate, Great Britain should mediate, the colonies should mediate. If they don't, they become, the League becomes hostile toward them because they're threatening the world peace. And so you're afraid of what the League of Armed Neutrality might well do to stop the war because there are two positions that can be taken. Either the status quo, whatever that happens to be, and it tends, you're like 1782, you're not happy if you're in South Carolina and Georgia because the British have occupied Savannah and Charleston. You don't want the status quo. What you want to do is go back to status 1763. And what will the mediation provide for? So that's a dangerous kind of situation. The South Carolinians and the Georgians petitioned Congress, don't accept this status quo situation. We don't want to be part of the British Empire. We want to be part of the American, independent America. And so finally, what Vergen and Tim is going to look much more closely at this than I have time to here. But basically, in the end, Vergen says there's going to be a war between Great Britain and France. So it's going to happen. Nothing we do can stop it. Even if we did try to remain neutral, the British would not allow us to be neutral. They would say that we were involved. They would say that we're helping the Americans, even if we weren't. So why shouldn't we help them if they're going to believe this anyway? And so that's his point of view. He asks his secretary, Ray Neville, to write a similar paper, his reflections. And these documents are in the Junta book that you have there, which is a great book. And I was involved in that, the 3-volume work, 3,000 pages. I indexed that for Mary. She's a very close friend of mine. And then when this reader came about, I was sort of a consultant with her, and in essence, convinced the publisher to do it my way rather than Mary's way. So it's set up as a pre-revolution, pre-peace, pre-1783 and post-1783. She just wanted to have one straight chronological run. But anyway, Ray Neville's reflections and Vergen's considerations are both in that, and very worthwhile reading. But he says what the Americans want is they want military supply, they want money, they need a navy, and we can all help them in those regards. France should not allow a reconciliation. That comes up all the time. And when there is a treaty, a commercial treaty, it shouldn't be totally advantageous for the French. I mean, the French are pretty good in this regard. They're not desirous of taking advantage of the situation. They see that their reward is England being diminished, not America being diminished. They realize they're not yet at a point that America has gotten to be a dangerous entity. That's a little bit later, that the Europeans don't want America to get too big for its britches. This time, the britches are small, and they're okay because they will detract from Great Britain, which is the main thing to obtain here. And so this is true. What Vergennes and Reynaval say, we don't want Canada. We're not going to go and try to get Canada back. We're not out for acquisitions here. We will acquire some French islands because they're ripe for the picking, just as our islands are ripe for the picking for Great Britain. And we hope that the Americans will defend any possessions that we get in the Caribbean. Finally, he's saying there's going to be a war again. So they all know it's going to happen. And then from the American perspective, what do the Americans want to get out of this relationship with the French? They want to raise the credit of America abroad. They want to guarantee American independence. They want to make sure that the American will to fight is there. And that's both for the patriots and that the loyalists won't be encouraged to pursue their activities at home. That if the French are going to be in alliance with us, that will diminish the enthusiasm and the ardor of the loyalists. And there are many loyalists all over the place. Who knows how many loyalists there are? My good friend Paul Smith wrote in his dissertation, 20% of the population was loyalists. I don't know if I would agree with that. It depends. It changes with the British Army's movement. And sometimes it could be 80% that are loyalists. Washington, when he gets into Pennsylvania in December of 1776, he started out in New York with 19,000 troops, 32,000 British troops. By the time 6 months later that he's in Pennsylvania, he's got about 2,500 men left, and the British have over 40,000. He says it's like a snowball. The British, they keep on winning, and they keep on getting more and more support, which is one of the wonderful things, helps the Americans, because where do you put 40,000 British troops and mercenaries in South Jersey? You can't. So you put them 1,000 here, 1,000 there, 1,000 in Trenton, 1,000 in Princeton. Washington can't defeat an army of 40,000. He can defeat an army of 1,000. And that's what he does in Trenton and Princeton because of the winter hibernation from fighting that he doesn't go into too early here. The Americans want to diminish the ardor of the loyalists. There will be. They encourage the French to get the commerce. Americans will get tremendous aid, including naval support from the British, and they hope that it will be a permanent alliance. It won't just be a temporary alliance. The Americans are. They learn to live with the Spanish and the English not going to war right away. They believe that, they understand that the European network of alliances intertwined, that France and Spain will suffer if they're viewed to be the aggressors, that their treaty partners are alleviated from supporting them if they're the aggressor. They support France and Spain if they are the victims of war, but not if they're the aggressors. And so that's a consideration. They will be, if they're not fighting, they'll be better able to support Americans with munitions and clothing and money. They will keep, even though they're not fighting, the danger of the French and the Spanish to the English will keep the British Navy and the British Army in the homelands. To a certain extent, that's beneficial to the Americans. The fact that the French and the Spanish are out of the war means that the American privateers have a monopoly on the British merchantmen. That's a nice thing. Rather than having to share these prizes with our allies. And as I mentioned, this is a nursery for the American Navy that is growing at this time. And then finally, there is the possibility of French officers and Spanish, but mainly French officers coming and joining our course, our fight in America. It turns out the French are not very effective, and most of the Americans and the Army, they don't care for the French officers that come over. There are exceptions. Obviously, Lafayette is one of the big exceptions to that. But others like Pulaski and DeKalb and von Steuben, these foreigners coming over, and the hope is that some of these French and Spanish officers will come. What we're looking at particularly is engineers. We need engineers that will help create forts. And that's the big thing for Kosciuszko. Kosciuszko? Kosciuszko, it's also pronounced, but Kosciuszko is the correct Polish pronunciation. He's very effective as an engineer. And so it's hoped that we'll get support that way. Finally, the king says, okay, let's support them. Let's do it secretly. Let's not announce this. Let's not compromise our principles. We should, in fact, support them. Why doesn't Spain come aboard right away? Well, they have their own reasons. Sandy mentioned the connection between France and Spain. It's known as the Family Compact. Both of their monarchs are Bourbon, the Bourbon family, and so they have a very close connection. France also has a very special law that will not allow women to come to the throne. So there are no queens in Spain. You have no Queen Elizabeth in Spain. In France, you have no Queen Isabella. It's prohibited by law in France. But there is that connection, and they work together often, and partly not just because they're a family, and that family compact is a name that's there at the time, but also because the joint enemy of England for many, many years brings them together. So they're going to work together. The Spanish fleet is still out there. The money fleet has yet to come back. They don't want that to be in jeopardy, to be on the high seas when they declare war. Their army and navy in Brazil fighting there has not yet returned, and they have not yet settled totally the peace that's necessary with Portugal. That's why the Spanish navy and army is in Brazil at that time. And then finally, they're getting their navy together in better form. The hope is that the sum total of the French and the Spanish navies will have superiority on the ocean above the British. And so that's an important factor for both sides. So those are the things that lead up to the treaties being established. I don't think it's so important that we go into the details of what's in the treaty, just the fact that that is arranged by Franklin the 6th of February, 1778, and it's announced in America. It's a major big deal. And one of the things it does is says there will be a French expeditionary force that will be sent over. And it is sent in 1780. The hope is to be 7,500 men, not that many at first, but a relatively small fleet stationed in Newport, Rhode Island. And it's there as I said, an expeditionary force. They're not, what that means is they're not there to engage the enemy by themselves. They're there to be cooperative with American expeditions, American initiatives, and they do work together very closely. So that is what begins. Franklin is very important in this as a negotiator of these two treaties of amity and commerce and alliance. But it is a critical factor in winning the independence of America. Without those treaties, doubtful that the Americans would have succeeded, unless it just was a tremendous war of attrition here, and went on forever and ever. It was 8 years long, a long war, but that treaty was indispensable.